This is a discussion about toughness or mental toughness, as the two terms are often used synonymously. And what I want to do here is try to reconcile the worlds of sport and the military, because oftentimes the sporting world in particular tries to take practices from the military in the name of building toughness or mental toughness. And I really want to try to um, get to the bottom of what both worlds can learn from one another, because I think that oftentimes the sporting world in particular takes the wrong things from the military when there's other things that would help athletes and organizations perform at a higher level, um, regardless of whether or not toughness is being built. And I'm going to define toughness and discuss what I think that it is or what it should be in terms of how we develop it. My name is Doug. I spent 13 years in the military working in the special operations community, and I'm currently a private practice physical therapist where I work with athletes and various organizations. I don't believe in deference to credentials. I really want this to be about ideas, but just having worked in both worlds, I just find this to be a really interesting topic. And this is by no means meant to be a definitive resource on the subject, but really just a way to initiate some conversation so that hopefully both worlds can learn from one another. So the narrative a lot of times is that if sport can take things from the military, especially different training methods. So if you look at the picture over here, this is a picture of some SEAL trainees at BUDS, which is basically the Navy SEAL selection course. And it's not uncommon to find sporting organizations bringing in members of the special operations community to run teams through like kind of mock selection courses. And the idea there is that it promotes team building and also presumably mental and physical toughness as well. But again, I don't think that, as we see in the picture here, like running around with logs over your head is really what's going to help athletes and teams perform at a higher level in sport. That's what I'm going to get to later on. Running around with logs doesn't even help Navy SEALs become better Navy SEALs. What we're seeing in this picture here is really more about how Navy SEALs are selected than how they are developed. And a big theme of this discussion or presentation is going to be that the sporting world often takes military selection practices and applies that to their own training, when even the military doesn't take things from this picture and truly consider it training. It's really a way just to identify people that are trainable for further development later on. And I don't know if any of you remember the movie Little Giants, but there's also this narrative that, you have to be mentally tough to play football. And they say it more eloquently in the video than I can do justice to here. So I'll play the video.
Hey man, they're gonna have to put you in a body bag. Prepare to eat rat. From Big Trouble. Okay. Yeah! But football, 80% mental and 40% physical.
So football's 80% mental, 40% physical. Obviously, the math doesn't add up there. And I think that, there's some legitimacy, humor aside, to that video. And that I think that psychological preparation is kind of an untapped area in sport. And the real question becomes, and again, I'm using kind of psychological preparation as an umbrella term. I think that's probably more useful than just saying mental toughness, because it's more about, again, being prepared, in my opinion, than being tough. So again, I think that psychological preparation is important. The question is, how do we really develop that? And is the best way to develop or to psychologically prepare athletes in sport to take practices from the military that are very sort of fatigue inducing and physically difficult, and then just think that athletes are going to make this mental and physical leap, where if they run around with logs over their head, all of a sudden it's going to make them better football players or better basketball players. I think, if that's the scenario, the answer is no, but I'm going to get deeper into kind of the why. And, who really cares? Like, why even get into this stuff? And so I'm going to go over why here. So the worst case scenario, and this is not like hypothetical, this has actually happened. The worst case scenario is that sporting teams try to mimic military training or military selection with, say, football players. And in these scenarios, again, which are not hypothetical, football players, athletes have literally died. So there was a case, I'm from Long Island, there was a high school football team from Long Island. They were doing, trying to mimic BUD/S, Navy SEAL selection. And they had a bunch of players carrying a heavy log. And I think one of the football players, the log crashed down on his head. He had a traumatic brain injury and literally died. We've seen other examples where, beginning of training camp, to make sure that, like in football players, especially like some of the bigger players, so like the linemen, to make sure they're in shape. It's a hot day, a large heat index, 90 plus degrees, 90% humidity. Let's have these 250 plus pound athletes run repeat 300-yard shuttles or 100-meter tempo runs over and over again. And we've had some of these athletes go into cardiac arrest or have heat stroke and die. And it's the sad thing is, in my opinion, they're dying for absolutely nothing. I mean, it would be one thing if an athlete had an undiagnosed heart arrhythmia, and in the course of practicing actual football and scrimmaging and doing more game-based scenarios, that athlete had some kind of a heart attack and died. It would be tragic, but at least you could say, well, that athlete was doing something that would be helpful to the game. But in a lot of these scenarios where we see these athletes having fatal outcomes, they're not doing things that I think are developing them as football players. And I'm not familiar with really too many instances where athletes have died doing or been seriously injured, permanently injured, doing things that look like the game. It's oftentimes when they're doing things that, again, mimic like Navy SEAL training or something that is romanticized, because we romanticize things we don't understand, but has very little carryover to the sport. That's the worst case scenario. So I think these real life scenarios alone sort of justify this type of presentation, because I haven't seen too many really thorough discussions on the topic. And I want this to be a resource for coaches where it can be distributed to people that maybe are, and I think most of these coaches are well-intentioned. No one's trying to kill athletes, obviously. Most coaches are doing it because they want to develop young people and make a difference in people's lives. And they see sport as kind of a vehicle for personal growth. And nobody wants these outcomes, but I want to share this presentation and distribute it among the coaching community. So even maybe coaches who are more prone to, doing this type of like running based conditioning or trying to mimic military selection, I'm hoping that I'm making a logical case for why it's harmful and not very useful, and why they're just better uses of an organization's time if the idea is to prepare athletes physically and psychologically. So worst case scenario is people are actually dying doing this stuff. A better case scenario is that these athletes are doing things that maybe aren't that helpful to prepare them for the game, but no one's getting hurt. So it's physically harmless, but there's also kind of an opportunity cost here, because even if you're doing 300-yard shuttles with linemen and no one's getting hurt or dying, is that the best way to prepare athletes for what they're going to do in the game? Is it context specific? And again, I think the answer there is no. So a better case scenario is we just, we eliminate these practices and we replace them with something, more constructive, or we keep doing them and, in a way that maybe the athletes are more prepared, but still, is that really helping them to achieve the desired outcome? And I think that the best case scenario is that we actually replace some of these, what I think are harmful, or maybe, if I'm being more generous, just kind of useless waste of time practices, with things that actually are going to help ensure success on the field or on the court. And I think that to do that, it would look very different than Navy SEAL selection. Let's put it that way. So best case scenario is that the world of sport takes practices from the military that I think actually are going to help ensure success at an individual and organizational level. And I'm going to get into what some of those practices are here in a little bit. But again, the rationale for it is like people are dying doing this stuff, and it's for no reason. So what is toughness? We're going to define that or present various definitions on that in a minute here, but I think that I'll start by just saying what it's not. Oftentimes, I think we, in the context of sport, we define toughness as kind of the ability to just endure hardship. So here you see kind of two, I think they're the Buddhist monks, and one of them's kicking the other one in the groin. And I think that this picture, even though it's meant to be funny, it's kind of akin to what's going on at a lot of sporting practices. When you have 250-pound athletes running repeat 300-yard shuttles, I would say that probably has as much carryover to the game probably as lining each other up and taking turns kicking one another in the groin. And so you can make a case that kicking each other in the groin might have less of a downside, because unless you have like a UFC fighter doing it, no one's probably going to die from that. But again, it's not just about the ability to endure physical hardship. It's like, what are we really trying to get at when it comes to mental toughness, psychological preparation, and in a context specific way. I don't think the ability to just endure physical hardship for its own sake is the means to that end. So why even bother defining this? I mean, why bother defining anything? Because a lot of times these discussions can become very sort of academic and theoretical, and I think people can miss the bigger point. But I think it is important to attempt to define some of these things, because number one, we need to make sure we're speaking a common language. I think there are a lot of conversations, even outside of sport, some very important conversations, like political ones, where people have these discussions and they're just talking past each other, because even though they're referencing the same word or the same concept, they fundamentally define it in different ways. And that's why they end up just speaking past each other. So I want to make sure that, at least as far as, we can control it here, that we're speaking a common language. Another reason is just to avoid circular definitions, circular reasoning, because sometimes when people are trying to, when the goal is to like win a discussion, which this is not about like winning here, this is about trying to dissect some of these ideas and just really prevent harm and help athletes succeed. But when people are trying to win debates, they oftentimes define things in ways where they can't be wrong, and it becomes very sort of circular. And that's not the attempt here, is not like really to win an argument or to persuade anybody. It's again just to discuss some ideas. Now that said, I think that linguistic precision is important, but it only matters, to a point, because we have to make sure we're asking the right question. And is the goal to be mentally tough, or is the goal to be prepared, right? And I think that sometimes, like, if the focus is so much on like, all right, what is toughness and how do we develop it, that becomes the goal, and we miss the bigger picture, which is like psychological preparation is just one component of overall preparation, and the goal is to be holistically or globally prepared. And as much, and even then, it's hard to oftentimes separate the physiological from the psychological, from the technical, from the tactical. But the goal here is not to, in my opinion, create sort of the most mentally tough people. The goal is to produce the most prepared people. And just going back to the previous slide here, one thing that I wanted to add is that I think a lot of times where this sort of mentality of like just the ability to endure hardship comes from, I got this from actually Tony Holler, who's a track coach, who has kind of like and I mean this in a good way, a minimalist approach to developing sprinters. He's a very accomplished high school track and field coach, and even in education. We actually did a podcast. He's a chemistry teacher. He and I, on the Resilient Performance podcast, did an episode about just the educational system in general. And it's the old saying, we oftentimes mistake activity for achievement. And sometimes the things that really matter are very difficult to quantify. But in order to make ourselves kind of feel productive, we like, it's very easy to say, well, we practice longer than any team. And it's like, when there's political pressure or organizational pressure, even if you're losing, if you say, well, we practiced really hard and we ran hard and we try hard, and you can quantify, like, we were on the field for this long at practice and we did this many 300-yard shuttles or this many gassers, no one's going to outwork us. I think oftentimes that provides kind of a cover or a smokescreen for being more thoughtful and asking the more difficult questions as to like, how do we actually make the best use of our time? But it's the same thing with, I think there's a cultural kind of impetus here, at least in the United States, where it's like people brag about how much they work. I work 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week. But me personally, I would love to be able to work a fraction of that and make just as much money and have more time with my family and have the work that I do be really, really productive and impactful. But it's just easy to say, well, I work this much and automatically equate that with with productivity, when I think that if we really dissect that, volume of work, it does not necessarily translate to productivity or efficiency. And it's the same thing with sport practice. The harder we try, the more times we kick ourselves in the groin, we're going to outwork the opponent and just assume that that leads to winning or success. And I really just don't think that it does. But again, it's volume of work is easy to quantify. Some of these things that I'm going to talk about are admittedly much harder to quantify, which makes them more uncomfortable. So just trying to kind of get to what I think it is that we're trying to get at when we talk about psychological preparation, mental toughness. Admittedly, what I'm going to read is a quote from a book, historical fiction, Stephen Pressfield, Gates of Fire. It's actually, in my opinion, even though it's fiction, it's one of sort of the best, some of the best writing I've seen on kind of like the warrior culture. And it's really not so much about bravado and preaching about toughness. It's more about, how prepared are you? How do you execute? And I think that this quote here speaks to that. And it also speaks to, some of the themes that I'm going to get into later in this presentation. So I'll read it here. Among the Lacedaemonians, it is considered a matter of indifference of whom and in what the enemy consists. The Spartans are schooled to regard the foe, any foe, as nameless and faceless. In their minds, it is the mark of an ill-prepared and amateur army to rely in the moments before battle on what they call pseudo-andrea, false courage, meaning the artificially inflated martial frenzy produced by a general's 11th hour harangue or some peak of bronze-banging bravado built to by shouting, shield pounding, and the like. Let the foe be Mantinean, Olympian, Epidaurian, let him come in elite units or hordes of shrieking rabble, crack citizen regiments or foreign mercenaries hired for gold. It made no difference. None was a match for the warriors of Lacedaemon, and all knew it. So this book was one of the inspirations for the movie 300. I think there's a scene in the movie 300 where a bunch of the Spartans are yelling and pounding their chests. And it's actually kind of the opposite, I think, of how Pressfield perceives the Spartans to be, where, all this stuff where it's like you just manufacture this hype before, a competition. Ultimately, it's about how prepared are you and how well do you execute. And none of that stuff, the chest pounding and the screaming and talking about how tough you are and trying to, verbally intimidate people. Ultimately, it's literally and figuratively noise. And what really matters is, can you execute under psychological and physical duress? And that's what we want to kind of get at here. So I think that a theme that's going to keep coming up here is kind of emotional control, the ability to block out noise. And I think a lot of sport is, there's narratives that I'm going to get into, playing with passion as an example, like where the harder you yell, the more you care, and that you can't win unless you're screaming and you're trying to like manufacture some of this emotional arousal. And like any other quality, I think that emotion being one, I think there's a healthy range. And I'm not suggesting that people don't do emotion is just a part of the human condition, but we're going to kind of get into the ways in which emotion and hype and manufacturing some of this arousal can actually hijack performance. So I think the quote about the Spartans here from Pressfield is a good starting point before we get a little bit more technical with some of these definitions. So as for some of these definitions, none of these are mine. I kind of reference here where I got these from. First definition that I think is very important, and they're all synergistic. So I'm not trying to create one sort of encompassing definition of toughness, because my point here is, again, is to be precise, but not get so far into the weeds where we lose sight of the bigger picture. But the first definition is from Steve Magnus, track and field coach at the University of Houston, and also really highly regarded author who just writes about performance in general, even some of the non-physiological and biomechanical factors. Real toughness is having the space to make the correct decision under high levels of stress and uncertainty. And Steve defines space as the place between emotional reaction and behavioral response. So this is the first time I'm going to reference kind of emotion and behavior and the relationship between those two things. The next definition, I got this from here when I'm flat, the rugby strength coach. and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is effectively how he defined mental toughness. I saw it, I think, in a tweet that he had. He defined it as the synergy between one's performance under varying levels of duress. So what that effectively means is, by this definition, if you are a basketball player and you can hit 95% of your free throws in practice, and that would include, maybe like, for example, say you want to simulate shooting foul shots with your heart rate elevated. So you run, a bunch of sprints or a bunch of suicides, go to the foul line, heart rate's elevated, and you can hit 95% of your foul shots. But then when you go into a game in a pressure situation where, um, if you were to miss those foul shots, it might directly impact winning and losing. And there's a crowd, you're playing in front of 20,000 people, whatever. If in that scenario, your percentage drops to 70%, then there's a discrepancy between your performance under these varying levels of duress. So I think we can safely say in that hypothetical situation that you can make 95% of your foul shots in practice. It's not really a technical problem. It's not an issue of maybe the mechanics of your shooting form or your positioning, your release point. You've proven that you can do that successfully. But when there's when there's more stress, more emotional duress, then the performance decreases. That's what I think that's the gap that we're trying to bridge when it comes to psychological preparation, if you want to call it mental toughness. It's how do we ensure that, again, emotion doesn't hijack performance, kind of going back to Steve Magnus's definition there. How do we develop this emotional control where we can block out the noise, so to speak, and just focus on the performance? And since we're talking about stress and the impact of duress on the emotional state of performance, I think it's important that we define stress. This is from Whitlock and Askin, who have done some research into psychological preparation in emergency medicine, which is an area that we're going to get into later, because I think that there's some really good things that the sporting world can take from emergency medicine. So they define stress as the result of a perceived imbalance between the demands of the emergency situation and your ability to meet those demands, where failure to do so has important consequences to you. So when there's a mismatch between your perception of your preparation and what's being asked of you, you're more likely to have an emotional state where it could interfere with your performance. So we're going to keep kind of repeating this theme, but the more prepared you are globally, which includes psychological preparation, the less likely you are to be sort of hijacked by this emotional response, because the more prepared you are, the more confident you are. And these voices, this noise, the emotional hijack that we're going to talk about is less likely to manifest the more prepared you are. But the less prepared you are, and if you're self-aware, you're going to perceive an imbalance between the demands of the situation and your ability to respond to those demands. And when there's a mismatch there, not only are you not prepared because you're not prepared, now it becomes a vicious cycle, because now your emotional state can actually hijack performance even more. So what do we need to do from here? We've kind of partially sort of defined psychological preparation, toughness, or at least we've gotten to, I think, what we don't want and sort of are closer to what we do want. So we want to, number one, identify the qualities of successful performers. Then we want to identify sound practices across various domains. From there, try to tease out what's trainable and what's inherited, because we can look at different populations and say, who work in high stress situations, and say these are what successful performers do. But it always comes down to like nature versus nurture. If some of those things aren't trainable, then we shouldn't spend time trying to develop them. So we'll try to tease that out, and then from there, sensibly apply sound practices given particular constraints. So what that means is you can look at what special operations members in the military do, but their job, if we're really getting down to it, is to kill people in war. So that's a very specific skill set. I know that a lot of times, coaches use war as a metaphor for sport, but again, if you're trying to create the best football players, basketball players, tennis players, even mixed martial artists, trying to prepare them as if they're getting ready for combat might not be the best use of your time. So yes, there are probably things that you can learn from members of the special operations community about preparation and professionalism, but to just blindly follow everything they do and assume that's going to carry over. It's like any other area of sport. Transfer is a key concept. We have to try to tease out, what are the key performance indicators that are transferable across different sports. So let's start by kind of demystifying the military, because again, we oftentimes romanticize what we don't understand. I think that the world of sport typically confuses military selection with training. So pretty much anytime I've seen sport coaches reference the military, it's like, it's a lot of times it's like it's SEAL training, because that's just, the media has kind of popularized that. But if you look at the point of BUDS, which is SEAL selection, I wouldn't even call it SEAL training. The point of BUDS is to identify candidates who possess the physical, psychological characteristics for follow-on training. Because the reality is, what really makes, say, a Navy SEAL is the ability to shoot, move, and communicate in a combat situation. They need to be skilled in scuba diving, in parachuting, in mountaineering, land navigation, all these technical things that most civilians have never been exposed to. So essentially, the military doesn't want to spend millions of dollars training people that are unlikely to succeed in their actual training program or training pipeline. So they have these selection programs where they basically use general stress as a proxy for some of these more specific characteristics, so that they can, albeit imperfectly, identify people that are worth investing time and money into. So BUDS is not SEAL training. And I wasn't a Navy SEAL, I was an Air Force pararescueman, so I won't speak for SEALs, even though I think I'm confident that what I'm saying is correct. So I'll speak to what I did. In the pararescue selection, it was very similar to SEAL training in terms of the physical demands. You crawl through mud, you're sleep deprived, you run around with logs and railroad tracks, you hold your breath underwater, sometimes until you pass out. But once I made it through that initial selection process, I never ran with a log over my head. I never carried a railroad track. I didn't crawl through mud just to crawl through mud. I might have been in a tactical, simulation where like I had to get in a prone position to return fire, but I didn't just crawl through mud to get dirty and tired. There were times when we were sleep deprived, but it was more because we were trying to maximize our training. It wasn't to make us tired for our own sake. I never had to hold my breath until I passed out after selection. So once we were selected, we did things that actually looked like our job. There's various skills that we had to be proficient in. We practiced those skills individually, and then we tried to kind of amalgamate those skills into full mission profiles that simulated real world missions, much like what you would do in sport, where early in the season you might work on like individual type drills, and then small sided games until you're actually scrimmaging and trying to simulate the real thing. So military selection is not military training. And in looking at military selection practices and then just trying to blindly apply those to sport training, I think again is, if I'm being generous, a waste of time. And if I'm not being generous in a more worst case scenario, you could actually hurt people for no reason. The other thing is, there's a narrative that like some of these military selection courses build character. So you build character through hardship. Granted, I think that exposing oneself to stressful and difficult situations and having to overcome that adversity, I think can kind of build confidence and resiliency. But the attrition rate in these special operations selection programs has been pretty constant for decades, and most of them it's anywhere between, I think it's between like 70 and 80%. So no matter if these programs actually developed character and built character versus revealing it, they wouldn't have such high attrition rates. If character was developed, then presumably more than 20 to 30% of these candidates would make it through the training. So once people, the earliest somebody can enter any of these programs is 18 years old. So not that people can't change when they're 18, but it's not, the goal of these programs is not to make up for someone's childhood and parenting. A large part of your identity is formed by the time you're 18. So while people can still develop and grow, in a lot of cases you kind of are who you are before you enter these programs. And I think it's a stretch to say that these programs are developing character. I think it's more accurate to say they're probably revealing it. And again, I'm not saying that people who make it through these programs are of higher character, but that's the narrative. So you can use a different word. You don't have to call it character, but I think these programs are probably revealing whatever quality it is you want to call it, more so than building it. And again, that's because the attrition rates have remained constant, for decades in these programs. And trust me, there's been people have invested a lot of time and money into trying to increase the success rate in these programs. And no matter what, whether it's the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, Marines try, it stayed pretty constant. So I want to, because oftentimes the sporting world has this obsession with the military. Normally, I don't like slides that are this wordy, but I really want to. I'm going to make this pretty informationally dense because I want to kind of demystify what it is that differentiates people in the special operations community, maybe from people who aren't as successful in the military or in those selection programs. And a lot of this research that I'm going to reference comes from Dr. Andy Morgan. He used to be at Yale, and now I think he's at the University of New Haven. He's done a lot of work looking at military special operations candidates. He's even done some work in the intelligence community. It's basically about how to identify talent in some of these like high stakes environments. So these are kind of personality traits that he's identified through his research. Not to say that I'm being agnostic. It's not that these things are good or bad. This is kind of just this is the situation, and then we can kind of try to talk about the relevance of this later on. So the first thing is, in identifying successful candidates in military special operations programs, first thing that Dr. Morgan noticed was their outlook on failure. They had a unique outlook on failure. So they were kind of characterized by their optimism. They regarded failure as a learning opportunity, not as a personal deficit. Failure motivates successful candidates to try harder. And in these special operations programs, a lot of times they're designed to repeatedly expose people to failure, to their breaking point, so they can see how these candidates respond under adversity. Obviously, you can take that too far. If every scenario is designed where people fail, you can sort of learn to be helpless. But what really differentiated the successful candidates was that even after being exposed to a lot of scenarios where they effectively failed or reached their breaking point, they maintained that optimism and they didn't let those failures define them. They look forward to the next training evolution, the next training mission, and they saw that as an opportunity to succeed and grow. Another quality that Dr. Morgan identified was emotional regulation. So successful special operations candidates, he went as far as to say they seem cold to outsiders. And this kind of emotional regulation, again, you could take any good quality to an extreme. Having emotional regulation in military training or in combat is very, very useful, and it has survival value. But there's also areas where being so kind of emotionally detached, like let's say in an interpersonal relationship or a marriage, can have problems. And so, that's where like these candidates can seem cold to outsiders because they don't get too up or too down. And there are instances where like having a little bit more maybe emotional arousal like can be useful, can have survival value. So again, this is just looking at a very contextual area. Military special operations selection courses. It's not to say that having the emotional regulation of a special operator is desirable in every single situation, but these people, to be clear, are being selected for a very specific thing. They identify threats. Makes sense that you would want to select people who can identify threats if they're going to do special operations missions in the military. And then another big one, and this is going to keep coming up, is singularity of purpose. You could call that focus. They block out noise. So whatever the task is in front of them they have to achieve, they focus on that task and they're not distracted by other things. Another quality that Dr. Morgan identified was bluntness. So the successful candidates were very blunt, very direct, which again, there are situations where you might have to be a little bit more delicate with your messaging, but in some of these high stakes, life and death environments, it's not always the time for deliberation and to softly package a message. Directness typically works in these kind of scenarios. And just being blunt helps to identify problems and generate solutions very quickly. This kind of goes back to what I talked about in the previous slide. These candidates, successful ones, viewed setbacks as temporary, changeable, that optimism. They confront threats, they don't avoid them. And we'll talk about dissociation in a minute. So confronting a threat, that's kind of the opposite of dissociating. Another big one is low neuroticism. In psychology, there's clinical neuroticism, there's a scale for that, but for our purposes here, we could say that these candidates aren't easily bothered or prone to feeling anxious, hostile, angry, worried. You know how there are some people who they always find something to be worried about? Those people probably wouldn't do well in these kinds of courses, because there's some people, just really anxious people, neurotic people, they kind of manufacture stress, and their perception of the stress is often worse than the stress that, or the threat they're actually under. So their perception of threat is greater than maybe the actual threat. People like that don't do well in these kind of special operations training scenarios. And these candidates are very, very thick-skinned because they're failing a lot. They're constantly being exposed to scenarios that are testing them, pushing them to their limits. And if they weren't thick-skinned, it's very easy to get defeated when you're constantly getting beat down like that. So I mentioned the word dissociation. I'm going to get more into it here. Dissociation is defined as mentally separating from the environment. That's in these military special operations scenarios. It's a bad thing typically to dissociate, and successful candidates were identified as having low dissociative properties. Now, again, anything can be good or bad depending on the context. Dissociation, or separating yourself from the environment, can be protective when circumstances can't be altered. An example that Dr. Morgan gave me was like in a child abuse scenario. If you are 3 years old and you don't have the means to support yourself, you can't escape from an abusive situation. It can be helpful to dissociate or mentally drift from your environment, because there's really nothing you can do that's under your control to make the situation better. You're so young that you're effectively helpless. But in the military and special operations, they're trying to identify people that even in the worst of scenarios, they have what's called an internal versus an external locus of control. So an internal locus of control means, regardless of the things that I can't control, there are things that I can control, and I'm going to focus on those things. It's kind of like the philosophical debate about free will. These are people who think that free will is a thing, and that they can shape their environment and shape their experience, maybe even sometimes to the point that they're delusional about it. But if you're dropped off in a hostile country in an almost impossible situation, even if it is impossible, you have to believe that once you're on the ground, you have to believe that it's possible to improve things for yourself. So Dr. Morgan looked at candidates in the SEER school, which is it's an acronym for survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. It's basically the school in the military where they teach candidates like how to evade capture and how to conduct themselves as if they were in a POW or prisoner of war situation. And he found that successful candidates didn't leave the scene or mentally drift. So in these SEER schools, basically what they're trying to teach people is, even though you're a prisoner, there's things that you can do to make your predicament better. There's also things that you can do where you can, even though they may have taken away your weapon, where you can kind of still fight and contribute to the effort on your team or your side. And I think a really good resource for that is, if you're interested in this stuff, Glenn Frazier wrote a book, and he was a POW in World War II, and he talks about some of the things that he and his fellow POWs did in a Japanese prison camp to kind of sabotage the war effort. Even though they didn't have weapons, even though they were being beaten, they kind of sort of maintain that soldierly ethos even as they were POWs. And that's what the SEER school is trying to instill in candidates. So the successful candidates, they confronted reality. They didn't hide from it. They didn't say, even though it can seem pretty helpless to be a POW, or in this case, a mock POW, they didn't say, I'm a POW, there's nothing I can do, I'm just going to pretend that I'm not here. Because when you're a POW, your mission is kind of either to sabotage the people that are holding you captive, or to escape. And to escape means that you have to come to terms with the fact that you're a POW, and you have to you have to identify threats and live in reality and not try to separate yourself from the environment because it's comfortable and mentally soothing. So dissociation, just to summarize this, is not useful when trying to problem solve or interacting with the environment. It can be protective in certain situations, but the military typically isn't looking for those kind of candidates because they want people that are always focusing on what's the mission at hand, what can you do to make your situation better? Because sometimes there's situations where it's just you or a small team and there's nobody else to come get you. Low dissociation is high focus. Confronting reality means you have to be focused on the things that are important, the things that can make your situation better or worse. Those who dissociate are more likely to hear all these external voices, their heads very noisy because they're trying to hide from the reality at hand. And again, that can be therapeutic and protective, but depending on the situation, it could also be disastrous. Dr. Morgan also conducted some hormonal research on these candidates in the various special operations programs. So there's this, like anything in biology, right? Things work best within a range. Just like any kind of good characteristic or good personal attribute, too much or too little is bad. It's always a range. Same thing for these hormones. So as far as the stress response continuum goes, prolonged or elevated glucocorticoids, which are stress hormones, can adversely affect different parts of the brain. So glucocorticoids in an acutely stressful situation are a good thing because they help mobilize energy stores. They help you respond to some of these, fight or flight scenarios. And if you've read the book, Why Don't Zebras Get Ulcers by Sapolsky, he talks about what happens when the stress response goes haywire and you've got, chronically elevated glucocorticoids and kind of the cascade of health problems that can lead to. So hormones exist as almost like this delicate orchestra where they need to be kind of balanced out. So neuropeptide Y is a hormone that's manufactured in the same cells that make norepinephrine, which is another major stress hormone. And neuropeptide Y mitigates the effect of too much epinephrine. It effectively, as Dr. Morgan says, it keeps the forebrain working or preserves critical thinking. So oftentimes in stressful situations, we kind of go into this like reptilian part of our brain because the forebrain, which is more associated with kind of like abstract, deeper level thinking, in a really acutely stressful situation, it's not necessarily the time to be abstract, but if that part of the brain is totally hijacked or not functioning well, then again, the system goes haywire. So neuropeptide Y helps to preserve critical thinking when high levels of norepinephrine are present. It helps to attenuate anxiety, right? Because again, a little bit of anxiety is good. It lets you know that a threat is there. Too much anxiety hijacks performance. This neuropeptide Y response, at least the high levels of it that are characteristic of military special operations candidates that were successful, is probably genetic. And in the candidates Dr. Morgan measured, he found that the neuropeptide Y levels may be normal in successful candidates compared to unsuccessful at baseline, but they were a third to a half higher during stressful events. And the successful candidates returned to baseline after that acute stressor, whereas the normal or the unsuccessful people were depleted temporarily after that stressful event. So the successful candidates just had a better neuropeptide Y, better overall stress response. And I love this quote from Dr. Morgan. I think it sums up performance under stress very well. He said, "Nobody gets more creative under stress. Some people just get stupider faster." And that's going to have implications when I get into kind of what we can learn from the aviation world about performance and checklists and standard operating procedures. An acutely stressful situation with a high degree of emotional arousal, that is not the time to be creative and find new solutions to problems, because people don't get more creative when they're under stress. Some people just get stupider faster. That's really, really important thing to remember. And we'll kind of get into the implications of that in a little bit. Another hormone that Dr. Morgan measured in these candidates was DHEA. That's a steroid hormone that's protective of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a region of the brain that's associated with memory preservation, and spatial orientation. So you can see how, if you're a special operations candidate, how being able, if you're on a mission, preserving memory and spatial orientation would be important. It's especially important in reconnaissance teams where there might be, hiding out, trying to identify threats and paint a tactical picture. The candidates that, again, had higher levels of DHEA were just sort of better able to recreate the scene in those scenarios, and presumably and partially because the DHEA was protective of the hippocampus. It's also protective DHEA against cortisol, which, again, a little bit of cortisol is a good thing. Too much of it, like any other hormone, not good. We want to keep these kind of hormones in balance. The DHEA levels are also probably genetic. And Dr. Morgan found that the DHEA levels in the successful candidates were higher at rest and during the acutely stressful events, and in some cases up to 5 times higher. Kind of area for further research. We can look into seeing if supplementation is helpful in other populations. Dr. Morgan speculates that at least in some of these successful special operations candidates, that supplementation might not be necessary because their natural levels are so high. But I think the question, from a research standpoint, a performance standpoint for other people is, people who don't have those naturally high levels, would DHEA supplementation allow them to perform more like the successful special operations candidates? Another area of Dr. Morgan's research, and I have the references for all these in the appendix, so you'll see that if you're interested in getting into the details of it. HRV, or heart rate variability, that's just a non-invasive way of gauging vagus nerve or parasympathetic activity. And I think it's important to touch on the narrative of HRV in sport. A lot of times is that, high HRV is bad and low HRV is good. So for example, if you have a performance or a training session and your HRV is low, that's seen as a bad thing. It's seen as, your kind of parasympathetic system is out of balance. But I think Dr. Morgan's research findings suggest that narrative isn't necessarily complete. So what he found, at least in the successful candidates in these special operations courses, is that they actually had lower HRV in many of the testing scenarios. So CQB, which is called close quarter battle, that's just basically room clearing, or it's combat inside a building. The people that were more successful at the CQB tasks actually had lower levels of HRV. The same thing with navigating underwater. So at the combat dive schools, where you basically have to dive at night and navigate underwater and get to various locations where it's literally pitch black and you're just trying to navigate with a compass underwater. People that were more successful at that had lower heart rate variability right before the task was performed. Same thing he found in some of the memory and problem solving exercises. So the conclusion that Dr. Morgan came to was that lower HRV during an acutely stressful situation helps you to kind of get in the zone. It makes you less anxious. It makes you more focused. You're not mentally ruminating or mentally drifting. It's essentially like when you're waiting to get in the game and you're chomping at the bit to focus and do that mission and really have be just tunneled in on one thing, i.e. navigating underwater, doing CQB, because again, those aren't the times to be mentally drifting and thinking about writing poetry or something that, a fight that you get into with your spouse or significant other. Like those situations actually require low variability. They require very, very specific focus. And so the idea that, low HRV is always bad, I think has been partially dispelled by some of Dr. Morgan's research. I think that, in the sporting world, what we need to look at is trends in HRV. So if someone, if their HRV is constantly low day after day, and that's the trend, that could be problematic. But if you have high days and low days, and you notice that on a game day or before a really hard training session that the athlete knows is going to be hard, but the HRV is low, that actually is not necessarily a bad thing. And it could be, it could suggest that the athlete has a more appropriate stress response. So variability is not always protective in acutely stressful situations. Just like creativity is not necessarily useful when you're confronted with a life and death situation right now. You need a good solution that's speedy and timely versus a perfect solution that's creative but might take a little bit longer. So the caveat to this is I'm not saying that low HRV is always good either. I'm just saying that low HRV isn't always bad. Dr. Morgan also found in the successful candidates that they had higher HRV at rest. So basically, what you want to have is when you're not in an acutely stressful situation, ideally, you have high HRV because you're not under threat. You've got a higher relative parasympathetic balance. And then when you're in an acutely stressful situation, you can, and it's game time, you reduce that HRV, you're more focused kind of biologically and neurologically, so you can perform and get in the game. So to summarize, the successful candidates in these programs had a greater overall variability of the stress response. It was high when it needed to be high, but it was low when it was time to perform. And I think that, those findings, again, it's not necessarily just because this is what's characteristic of the special operations population. It doesn't mean this is what football players or basketball players or rugby players or track athletes should demonstrate. But I think that it does shed light on the narrative that high HRV is always better. Next concept is transfer. That's obviously a key concept in sports. And when I asked Dr. Morgan about this, I'm like, what can the sporting world take from the military? This was also another podcast that we did on the Resilient Performance podcast. So in addition to reading some of these research papers that I referenced in the appendix, I'd also suggest if you're interested in this topic, I go deeper in the conversation with Dr. Morgan on the Resilient Performance podcast. Dr. Morgan said in the podcast that people move too far beyond the data. In other words, they're extrapolating things that you can't necessarily extrapolate from one environment to the other. Again, special operations is a very, very unique population. There's things that I think sports can learn, but to just, as a blanket rule, take everything special operations personnel do and apply it to sport. Just, again, people who are preparing for war and, for extreme violence, that's not as much as we like to metaphorically say that sports are war. Sports are not war. And I think making that sort of mental equivalence can actually decrease performance because you're focusing on the wrong thing. So as I mentioned before, the military uses general stress as a filter before it invests in training people for a specific situation. So the things that we see in these selection courses, it's because you can't find people off the street that are trained in free fall parachuting, combat diving, mountaineering, as I had to do in pararescue, emergency medicine, small unit tactics, close quarter battle, survival training, egressing aircraft. Like those skills take a lot of time and money to cultivate. And the military does not want to invest in people if they don't think at least can handle general stress. So just like in, when we're talking about like long-term athletic development, before we kind of specialize in specific sports, we want to have this overall broader GPP athletic base. That's kind of what the military is doing. The military is selecting people that have good psychological GPP before they do the more specific training. And I guess there are probably some people who maybe have poor psychological GPP who can be successful later on if they got a specific training. But as a blanket rule, the people who can handle general stress better do better when they encounter more of these specific stressors. So the military selection courses are identifying people that are trainable. These courses aren't really about, these courses, I wouldn't call them training per se. They're identifying trainable candidates who can get the specific training later on that's going to help them technically develop for their job and their mission set. So physical stress in the military, at least initially in the initial part of selection, basic training, selection courses, it's just a means to an end. The point is not to have the people that are the best at running around with logs. As I mentioned, once I made it through selection, I never did any of that stuff again. It was all about how can we be the most skilled rescue specialists that we can be for the mission set that's being demanded of us. The great thing about sport is it's not necessary to, especially like, let's say at the college level or the pro level, if you're an NFL scout, you don't need to have people crawl through mud, run around with logs, because you can actually watch film on people and you can create scenarios that are much more football specific to identify talent. So a lot of the things that the sporting world takes from the military, they take from these selection environments, when I think they should be actually looking at how do these people prepare for their jobs? How do they create realistic training scenarios? How do they operate at an organizational level to ensure that, people are communicating clearly and that, ideas are being disseminated and practices are being constantly refined? I think that's the stuff the military and the special operations community in particular does very well. And I seldom see sport coaches looking at those things. They look at like, how can we be tough like the Navy SEALs, when again, it's questionable and debatable whether or not Navy SEAL selection even develops toughness. We know that it's selecting it, but whether or not it's developing is questionable. And if it's questionable that it's developing in the military, it's even more questionable that it would develop football specific toughness for a football team at the high school, college, or pro level. So talent identification and stress inoculation should be as context specific as possible. And the flip side of that is because people, again, glorify, romanticize the military, the special operations community. There was a point in my career when I was trained where I would have felt confident, jumping out of a plane at night with equipment into, hostile type territory to stabilize and treat casualties and return them home to their loved ones. I'm not saying I wouldn't have had a stress response or any kind of emotional arousal doing that, but these things can be measured. And again, this is a hypothetical scenario because I haven't actually done it, but I'm pretty confident that if you measured my stress response, even before a real world mission in Afghanistan or Iraq, something would be there. It would be different than what my baseline stress level would be, but it would be much lower because I was prepared and confident in my own abilities and in the abilities of my teammates. I think that stress level would have been lower than if you put me in an environment I was totally unprepared for. Say you just took me randomly and said, okay, it's game 7 of the World Series and your team is up 3-2 and like you're going to pitch to the MVP. That's the first batter you're going to face. I'm not prepared for that situation. My stress levels, I think, would be much higher. My anxiety would be much higher in that situation. I would feel more comfortable being in an environment, or at least when I was in the military, I'd feel more comfortable in a scenario where people were shooting at me because I know kind of what to do in those situations, and I have resources to mitigate that threat. Then if you had me at my current weight, so right now I'm 180 pounds. If you put me in the 180-pound weight class right now against the current UFC champion in that weight class, I would be frankly much more frightened to fight in the UFC than I would to go to a hostile country where people have guns. So again, this stuff is context specific. It's not to say that people that are good at facing general threats, general stress, won't do better in specific situations. But in sport, you've already picked your personnel. You've already identified your talent. So if you're trying to develop that talent now, in my opinion, it should be as context specific as possible. And trying to mimic military selection courses, I think again, is in a being generous, it's a waste of time. And worst case scenario is like you can really hurt people. So to summarize that, preparedness demands repeated exposure to specific stressors, regardless of one's ability to withstand physical hardship. So more on I'm kind of closing up the military psychological research here, and then we're going to move on to something else. And this transcends the military, but many of the assessments that we use kind of in any field are just proxies for the things that we actually care about, right? Because if we're looking at things like whatever, college admissions, even like the NFL combine, standardized tests, the things that we really care about are hard to quantify. So we have proxies. We try to be objective, even though a lot of times, subjective measures and gut feelings might be more insightful than just an arbitrary test that we can quantify. We want to at least appear to be objective. So we have these tests that are very easy to standardize. Whether or not they always identify the best people is debatable. And that's kind of that's a timeless discussion. But, these proxies reflect other qualities that can be indicative of high performers. And it's a selection bias. So like people who do well on standardized tests, or who, do well, like say at the NFL combine, like we can debate about whether or not the 225 bench press is useful for for like an offensive or a defensive lineman. But if somebody goes into the combine and bombs that test, it might suggest they just blew the test off. So at a minimum, doing well on these tests suggests that people have some degree of self-discipline. They care enough to prepare for the test. They exhibit some delayed gratification because it shows that they can invest into something without getting an immediate return on investment. They get that later. But again, these things are just proxies. They're not perfect. The best way to evaluate talent is to put people in a highly contextual environment and see how they perform. But those things can be easier to break down and quantify. And an example that I would use is if you look at physicians, right? They take their licensure exam or their boards exam. And I'm not a physician, but those that I've talked to have said that, like, let's say it's a surgeon who's been practicing for 20 years. Almost any physician I've talked to, surgeon I've talked to, has said that if they had to go back and take the licensure exam or the boards exam, the step 1 or step 2, whatever it is that the medical students take, they'd probably fail it. So what does that say about the pure utility of that test? If someone that's been practicing medicine successfully for 20 years in a really difficult specialty, like say neurosurgery or orthopedic surgery, if they can't pass the entry-level baseline doctor test, how useful is that test? That test really is just a test of one's ability to recall information and to study very hard. But people who can recall information, any information, and who are devoted and study hard are likely to do well in many, many things. But again, you're trying to select people who can go through a residency and a surgical fellowship. So we have these imperfect proxies. But I think that pretty much all organizations can benefit from trying to look at, like, are we really testing the things that we care about, or is this just a proxy? And ultimately, anything is going to be just a proxy because it's hard to put people, in game-like conditions all the time during an evaluation. But I think that a lot of the things that we do to measure talent, really, it's just kind of more of a selection bias. You're identifying people who care enough to prepare for that test. You're not really testing for specific abilities. And that's what these military selection courses are doing. I think they work really well, but they're admittedly imperfect because, once you're in a special operations unit, you're not running around with logs and railroad tracks and, laying in cold water for no reason. You're actually you're doing a job. And so the more that our selection can mimic the job, or our tests, entrance exam can mimic the job, the better. So the recommendations to the sports world, as far as that goes, is be systematic. Like have a system, identify KPIs or key performance indicators, and then try to create tests and realistic scenarios that reveal and cultivate these KPIs. So tests shouldn't be just about revealing something that's important. They should also help develop them, because so many times I see people where they have these tests, like, oh, it's testing day, and that actually takes away from training. The test should help develop you if it's a good test. And a lot of times I think whether it's like sports or even some of the stuff in the military, the tests they actually detract from training instead of serve as something that's complementary. So I summarize the military stuff, not to say that this is good or bad. This is just what, people who have researched this population, these are the characteristics that those researchers have found that differentiate the successful from the unsuccessful people. Whether or not they, transfer or they matter in the context of sport, again, we'll kind of get into that deeper, but that's the population. But a theme that kept coming up was the kind of emotional regulation, emotional control. And that is something that I think that the sporting world probably could do a better job of, because I think that a lot of times the sporting world, they encourage things like playing with emotion, playing with passion, without recognizing the downside. And if you look at high stakes fields like the military, aviation, emergency medicine, what's fundamentally different about those areas than sport? At the end of the day, you have to perform and execute a skill under emotional duress. So, and I don't typically see, as we're going to see in this video, this is, if you've heard of, Sully, there's the movie Sully. He's the pilot who had to, because of I think a bird strike in the engine, had to land the plane in the Hudson River. So this is a reenactment of that landing, but it's superimposed with the actual radio control, the radio call that the captain Sully made to air traffic control. And the big thing I want you to pay attention to here is just the calm in his voice. And if we follow that sporting narrative, it would be, well, like you're not flying with any passion, you're not flying with any emotion. But if you were on this plane, would you want this person to be emotionally aroused and screaming at the air traffic control at the tower while he's trying to land the plane? And if the answer to that question is no, then why do we encourage those things in sports? So let's listen to the call, because I think it's really insightful. And then we can kind of get into, how do you develop this? Is this nature or nurture? We know that from the research on the special operations candidates, a lot of it might be genetic based on some of those hormone levels, and the attrition rates have remained pretty constant. So there is the nature component, but I think that there's also things that we can do to develop some of these qualities, and aviation does a great job of that, in my opinion. But let's listen to the call just so we can kind of get a baseline of what it is that I think we should be striving for when it comes to performance in high stress scenarios.
Cactus 1549, 700, landing 5,000.
Cactus 15.9, departure to contact, I maintain 15,000.
Maintain 15,000, Cactus 1549.
Cactus 15.9, turn left lane 270.
This is Cactus 1539, hit birds to lost thrust. I'm hoping it's returning back towards LaGuardia.
Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left heading up 220.
220.
Tower, stop your departures, got emergency returning. It's 1529. He bird strike, he lost all engine, he lost the thrust in the engines, he's returning immediately.
Cactus 1529, which engines?
He lost thrust in both engines, he said.
Got it.
Cactus 1529. We can get it for you. Do you want to try to land 1013?
We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
All right, Cactus 15.9. It's going to be left traffic to runway 31.
Unable.
Okay, what do you need to land? Do you want to try to go to Teterboro?
Yes.
Teterboro, Empire, actually, LaGuardia departure guy, emergency inbound.
Hey, guys.
Cactus 1529 over the George Washington Bridge, wants to go to the airport right now.
Wants to go to our airport. Check. Does he need assistance?
Yes, it was a bird strike. Can I get him in for runway 1?
Runway 1, that's good.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280, you can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus? Cactus 15.9, radar contact is lost. You also got Newark Airport up at 2 o'clock in about 7 miles. Eagle 54718, turn left thing 210.
210, 4718. I think he said he was going in the Hudson.
Cactus 1529, Houston.
Cactus 15.
So what I really like about that is, even when the air traffic controller was trying to divert the captain to a different airport, and the captain knew that that was not going to be possible, he never got snappy or frustrated with the tower. He just said, "I'm landing in the Hudson," just matter of factly. And again, if you were on that plane, I mean, obviously, if you're a passenger, you're not privy to that conversation. But imagine if that conversation between the pilot during the emergency landing in the river and the air traffic controller was broadcasted, to the passengers, and you were a passenger. Would you want to hear that captain yelling at the air traffic control, or getting frustrated? I don't think that you would. At least I wouldn't. And so I ask, like, what's different about sports? Why is it that we have coaches all the time who are constantly preaching about discipline and emotional composure, but then when their player makes a mistake, they berate the player, they scream at the player. When the ref makes a bad call, which again, that's something you don't always have control over, right? Bad calls are part of the game. Screaming at an official. I mean, so a lot of times the messaging, what coaches say they want and what they do kind of conflict with one another. And I really want to get into this whole idea about playing with passion and playing with emotion, because I think that it's important. Look, you want to have joy when you play a sport. And I'm not saying that people should be robots, but it's like anything else. If you're going to encourage people to play with all this passion and emotion, it's like dancing with the devil, because the higher you go up, the higher there could be a down. I think like any other quality, you want emotion should be within a certain range where You don't get too high and you don't get too low, because at either of those extremes, I think that it interferes with execution. And there's also a tangible cost to be paid for, playing with too much emotion. Because if you look at like football, right, like you can get an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty, like that actually costs yardage. In basketball, you can get a technical foul. So lack of emotional regulation, it's not just this abstract thing, like it actually has tangible consequences in sport in the short term. But I think it can also, it can mentally cause people to dissociate, because they're just thinking about these things that they can't control, that have already happened, when they should be focusing on like, all right, what's the next play? So I don't think that sports are fundamentally different than these other kind of high performance areas that actually do encourage emotional regulation, whether it's like aviation, the military, emergency medicine, because all these things ultimately come down to skill, execution, and communication. And I can't think of too many scenarios and communication are enhanced by a ton of emotional arousal and anxiety and anger, which tends to characterize a lot of even successful coaches. So I think some coaches actually succeed in spite of what they do, because they're so capable and competent in other areas. Their emotional regulation not always being one of them. So what's the role of emotion here? And we talked about kind of this notion of playing with passion or emotion versus emotional regulation. I think that playing sports should be fun. So I think that, like players should encourage their the team should cheer and applaud and encourage teammates when something is going on. But I don't think people should be, like fanatical about it either. So again, it should exist within a range, because once it's too high or too low, then you're kind of operating in the red. There's an emotional component to learning, right? So again, I'm not saying that people should do things in the absence of any kind of emotion, and some level of arousal and increased heightened emotion does help with performance, because it elevates stress hormones that help you, respond to some of these difficult situations. It's just when that stress response goes awry. And I just think that in sports and in most, areas of performance, the issue is typically that people are over aroused, not that they don't care, they don't play with enough passion. If anything, they care so much and their arousal is so heightened that it actually interferes with their execution. But the emotional component to learning is huge, and we grow, we learn from situations that are stressful. So like, I mean, for example, I was 21 when September 11th happened. I remember exactly where I was, because that's an event that was, elicited a lot of emotion. And I remember exactly how I felt the moment that my son was born, that he cried for the first time, took his first breath, and I replay that scenario in my head all the time, and I'll never forget it. It's very, very clear to me. So we need some level of heightened emotion or arousal to learn and imprint memory. And this has survival value, right? Because when we talk about things like pattern recognition, if 1,000 years ago somebody was in a forest and ate a certain color mushroom that made that person feel deathly ill, well, the next time that person saw the same color mushroom, they're probably going to remember it, because they can recall the last time they ate that color mushroom, they got really, really sick. So emotions and even negative emotions help facilitate learning. They help with memory formation and pattern recognition. And this is why even in some cases, certain types of biases and prejudicial behavior can be beneficial, because they're mental shortcuts, right? And when we're talking about like survival, it's, can you avoid catastrophic harm even at the expense of accuracy? So it's, when we're talking about like, maybe not all purple mushrooms will kill you or will make you sick, but if your experience eating purple mushrooms is that they do, you're better off not eating that purple mushroom than taking the chance that the next purple mushroom you encounter won't be one that makes you sick. So it's really, a lot of times, survival is about avoiding harm, even at the expense of being totally accurate. So you can have some, false negatives, false positives, as long as practices that survive. Oftentimes, even if they're not perfect, I think there's often a misconception that like evolution is perfect. Like evolution it's not one thing; it's a sort of totality of behaviors, and we need an emotional emotional experiences to develop some of this pattern recognition. Again, motion needs to be within a homeostatic range. You don't want to get too high or too low, but that heightened emotion, I think, can actually enhance performance. The question here is, how do we prevent that heightened emotion from getting cascading so far out of control that it actually hijacks performance? Because too much passion and emotion can come at a cost. And along kind of the theme of playing with emotion is this idea of character building. Play with passion. We're going to build character when we play sports. I hear that a lot from coaches. And I think that sports are a great vehicle to develop character. I think that sports, if they're properly managed, the constraints are there to kind of develop people, because I think that what we love about sports is that there are things that are bigger than the game. I think that the games, the sport can be a great teacher, but when your character building becomes the overarching objective, I think we can lose sight of the goal, which is like, this is just my opinion, but like let the sport a lot of times do the teaching. It's kind of like constraints-based learning with change of direction. Like you can do all these like very, very like rehearsed change of direction drills versus just doing a small sided game, assuming someone's healthy enough to do it, and letting the game teach that perceptual component of change of direction and agility. But when we say like, okay, like we're coaches and we're here to build your character versus just preparing people for what they're going to encounter in their sport, I think it can kind of lead to this almost self-righteous idea that like we need to constantly be preaching things like playing with passion, playing with emotion, where I think if you have a good system and you do what you're supposed to do, those things will rub off without constantly having to talk about it. It's kind of like going back to the slide earlier on about the pseudo-andrea. You can be a tough and fearless military force without telling everybody how tough you are. You can develop character. You can instill some good qualities in athletes without telling people, okay, I'm building your character. Like let kind of the game do the teaching with the right constraints that can happen. Because I think that if the focus is like, okay, I am the coach and I'm going to do all this stuff to build character, I think then you kind of get into this stuff where like I've got to constantly be preaching like about playing with passion, playing with emotion. And I think that you lose sight of like the goal here is to execute, be successful, and let the game do the teaching. Because I think that the more we kind of see ourselves as like character builders and facilitators of passion, it raises our own emotional arousal, and it becomes difficult to regulate our own behavior. The quote I want to read here is from Roger Sparks. He was an Air Force pararescueman and Marine member of Marine Force Reconnaissance. He was actually an instructor at the Marine Reconnaissance School, which is one of their special operations forces. And this is a quote from when he was an instructor. He said, "It is always important never to lose your temper and always be in control. Yelling means you've lost control. You're not really there." So if you're yelling at a player to be disciplined, if you're yelling at a player presumably to build character, and again, I'm not saying never do it, because there's always a time and a place for certain things, but if that's kind of the defining characteristic of a coach, is like they're always yelling at people to develop their character, to be disciplined. If they make a mistake, they get screamed at. Now as a coach, you've mentally drifted, because we can take an example of, say, an offensive lineman who jumps off sides. I don't think any offensive lineman that jumps off sides is trying to sabotage his team or did it deliberately. When that happens, it's there's some kind of a breakdown in the ability to anticipate the snap count, to process information. And when you see it all the time, a player commits a penalty, goes off sides, goes back to the bench, gets screamed at, and what does the coach say? The coach says, "Hey, don't effing get off sides," as if like the player didn't know that he wasn't supposed to jump off sides. But how does stating the obvious actually help that athlete not do it again? That's in a game. What about in practice? If the same athlete does that, now they're going to have to go run laps because they made a mistake. So now you're just making them, and you're building character and toughness at the same time. Well, you made a mistake. We're going to make you tough. We're going to make you run. But how does running laps around the field or running gassers or 300-yard shuttles help you the next time to not jump off sides? it's doing something, but I don't think it's doing the thing that we want it to do. It's very tangential and peripheral at best. But again, once we start getting into these things like, well, we're gonna, yell at people to make them tougher, or yell at them to make them better people and not make mistakes. I think as coaches, we make it more about us than about the athlete. I think we're doing things that are self-serving and make us feel better, and we're kind of sort of a slave to our own emotions versus figuring out like, all right, like how do we make this athlete more successful the next time? And emotional restraint is trainable. And a great example of this, and this is something that in the military I observed, was in doing CQB, close quarter battle, which again is just essentially room clearing. You could think of like a hostage rescue scenario where a team enters a room, and in training you might have, say, a picture, a paper target of a hostage taker and a hostage. And I think we can all have an idea, based on like our personal experiences and biases and how the media portrays certain things. We have an idea probably of what a hostage taker might look like, right? So I think most people would assume that the hostage taker was male, probably had like an angry face, right? Same thing with if we're talking about like what does a terrorist look like? You could put a paper target up of what conforms to most people's biases of what a terrorist looks like. And in novice operators in CQB, a lot of times like they'll enter a room even when no one's shooting back at them. They're just doing even a walkthrough at a slow speed, because the goal, and even in the military, when you teach these skills, kind of like a crawl, walk, run. So the first thing might be, okay, going in with a simunition or a paintball gun, going into the room slowly. There's no opposition forces. There's no role players, and the goal is just to go in as like say a 3 or 4 person team, clear the room, and shoot at the right paper target with that paintball round. And early on in training, we saw all the time where somebody, let's say, would shoot at the person that looked like a terrorist or a hostage taker, because emotionally we have this preconception of what that thing looks like. And over time, what they teach you to focus on, they say focus on the hands, because focus on where the gun is. So like, they would in these scenarios do things where like maybe the woman was the one holding the gun to the angry looking man's head. And so in that scenario, you're supposed to shoot the woman with the gun and not the angry looking man. But early on in training, because we have these biases, and we like entering a room and seeing a picture or knowing you're encountering a hostage situation evokes certain emotions, people responded to their biases, responded to their emotions, and actually shot the wrong target, even when they were under no threat. Over time, with the right training, with the right constraints, you learn to focus on the hands and focus on the actual threat, not what you perceive the threat to be based on how you were sort of, in some ways, programmed by the media, by society. So if something like that can be trainable, I think that any kind of restraint or emotional composure is trainable, because just shooting the wrong target, it's not a physical issue. It's an issue of someone was hijacked by their emotion. They were hijacked by their biases because they have a certain conception of what a bad person looks like. And they were emotionally hijacked when they pulled the trigger and shot the wrong person in training. And this is obviously a huge thing now, because we see these viral videos of innocent people being harmed by law enforcement, sometimes fatally. And I get frustrated when I see how these things are politicized, because I think people focus on oftentimes like things that won't actually make any kind of a difference, versus this is a training issue. Whether we can look at these videos in the comfort of our living room or in front of our computer, and we could say, well, that officer was under no duress. They shouldn't have used lethal force. They shouldn't have pulled their gun. But the reality is that officer perceived a lethal threat. Like no officer wants to be on a viral video and ended up, with this scrutiny and basically like have their life ruined and have that, on their conscience. I mean, maybe there are some sociopathic officers that do want to harm people, but I think that's a very small percentage, even of the people that we end up seeing in these viral videos, if at all. I would say that, you have to look at these things in good faith and assume that these officers are doing the best job they can with the training that they have. It's not a justification for what's happening, but it's a training issue. And because they're emotionally hijacked, even their perception of what the threat is compared to what the reality of the threat is, that disconnect is causing them to go for their gun, and it leads to a lot of these tragedies. And so, like, you have to prepare people to regulate their emotions, create realistic training scenarios. Otherwise, I think a lot of the stuff that we see proposed as solutions for these very tragic events, it's just political signaling. It's not going to make any difference, and it's kind of like it's a waste of time and money. And in the interest of wanting to see less of these, it's really frustrating that people aren't really talking about, like, it doesn't matter whether we think that that threat was justified or not. That officer perceived a real threat. How do you create training scenarios where they can more accurately detect what the actual threat is versus being hijacked by emotion and having their perception of the threat go haywire, and now they're in this situation where they've totally escalated, and it can lead to tragedy. But again, this stuff is trainable. So some insight from emergency medicine here, because we're talking about restraint and regulating emotions, and I think that emergency medicine as a field is starting to do a great job of this. A lot of the work that I'm going to reference is from Michael Loria, who is actually also a former Air Force pararescueman. Now he's an emergency medicine physician in New Mexico. He also does a lot of training and education. He's a flight doctor, and he's not that he's the first person to do this, but he's one of the first people that I've seen to recognize that a lot of the failures that we see in medicine come from human factors, things like communication, things like emotional regulation, not technical knowledge. Like when we see some of these maybe preventable unfortunate circumstances in medicine, it's not because that a doctor or that nurse didn't know what to do, or they couldn't perform that skill. They didn't demonstrate that skill in training. Medicine is effectively a team sport, and things like communication, emotional regulation, a lot of times are the determining factor between a successful procedure and an unsuccessful one. And like I said, Mike Laurie, I think, is somebody who's bringing this to the forefront. So he wrote a paper, again referenced in the appendix, about psychological skills training in emergency medicine. And he defined psychological skills training as the systemic acquisition and practice of different psychological techniques to improve cognitive and technical performance. And some of the contributing variables to kind of the emotional state and to the stress response are things like time pressure, uncertainty, vagueness, incompleteness of information, and our limitations in the ability to process information. So these same things, time pressure, uncertainty, processing of information, are very, very important, obviously, in the world of sport too, both on like an individual level in terms of executing a skill, and on an organizational level in terms of strategy and tactical execution. So basically, like, how do we perform under stress when we have incomplete information under time constraints? That's like, and if you go back to Kier's definition, that's what we're talking about. Like, how do we bridge that gap between somebody performing a skill under greenhouse conditions to performing a skill under time pressure, uncertainty, and when there's limitations in the ability to process information? And that's what some of Dr. Laurie's research is trying to get to. So he talks about mindfulness, because you need some degree of self-awareness to kind of set some of these steps in motion that we're going to talk about. You define mindfulness as being aware of one's feelings, thoughts, and sensations in the moment. So that's also, again, the opposite of dissociation. When you're dissociating, you're trying to escape from reality versus confront it. And when you know that maybe your emotions could be getting the best of you, or your anxiety is heightened, how do you confront that in a useful way? So he makes the point that psychological skills in a vacuum do not necessarily enhance execution. That's really important. So the psychological skills training has to supplement, not replace, clinical training, and it has to be somewhat context specific. So some of the steps when it comes to, like performing a life-saving procedure that Dr. Loria talks about in his research, and this is like a checklist that that he goes through and that he recommends to some of the other emergency providers that he educates and works with. First thing is just kind of controlling your breathing. Next thing is positive self-talk. Positive self-talk allows you to control the narrative, right? It gives you that internal versus that external locus of control. You drown out the noise and you focus on, through your positive self-talk, the thing that's going to help you execute, not the things that are going to distract you from your performance. He talks about seeing, so that's things like visualization exercises, imagery, mental rehearsals. And the last thing is focus. So focus could be a trigger word to shift attention to a single prioritized task. And again, the idea is we're trying to drown out noise and focus on what's going to make us successful in the moment. So as far as breathing goes, hear a lot about breathing. What's important about breathing in this scenario is that breathing is really it's our conscious gateway to the autonomic nervous system. So breathing can be something that we don't think about at all, and that we can consciously change. So breathing is a way to kind of blur the conscious and the unconscious. So when we're, in the case of an emergency medicine provider, when they're about to perform a life-saving procedure and, they get that autonomic response, that stress response, they know subconsciously something important's about to happen, something potentially catastrophic if they don't execute. Their heart rate spikes, their breathing rate is elevated. That might happen without them thinking at all. And if they can recognize, like, okay, I'm starting to get maybe aroused to the point that it's going to interfere with my skill execution, controlled breathing is a way to kind of mitigate that response. So, like I said, it blurs the conscious and the unconscious because it's a conscious way to control an unconscious process that might, even though it's helpful, if it's overdone, it can actually have deleterious effects. The recommendations for self-talk: keep phrases short and specific. Use the first person and present tense. That makes you in the moment. It's about you're in control, and you're in the here and now, which again facilitates focus, not dissociation. The self-talk should be positive, not negative. You want to recite the phrase to yourself with intention, speak kindly to yourself, and repeat the phrases often, just that positive reinforcement. An example of self-talk in the context of emergency medicine might be, this person needs my help to survive, and I can do it. Or something that's more instructional might be, focus on the needle angle going into the skin. Visualization, the next step. Dr. Loyer references some functional MRI research. So basically what they found is visualizing the successful execution of a task excites and activates the same regions of the brain as actually performing the task. Now, the limitations to this research is the gold standard here is, what do people do when they're actually performing the task? You have to perform a task that can be done in an fMRI machine, right? So you're not going to have you can't play a football game in an fMRI machine and see how a quarterback processes the information. But I think it's promising. And I think based on this research, there's no harm to, if you're going to have to do something, visualize yourself doing it successfully and visualize the steps that it's going to take to execute that skill successfully. And the last thing is focus, right? How do we drown out the noise? How do we focus on the mission at hand? Because attention is finite, and you don't want your attention in a life-saving procedure in emergency medicine competing with something that's going to distract you from what needs to be done. So in terms of putting it all together, the example they use in this paper is talking about a patient who might need a thoracotomy or a chest tube. So that's basically like if someone has trauma to the chest, if air or blood gets into the pleural cavity or the cavity that houses the lungs, that can actually constrict the lungs, constrict the heart, and it can actually lead to death. So the procedure for that is what's called a thoracotomy or a chest tube. You insert the chest tube between somebody's ribs, and then you can aspirate or basically suck out the air or the fluid so that the lung can reinflate, and so that the heart can actually expand between beats. So scenario they use in the paper is basically EMS arrives, paramedics arrive. They drop off a patient in the emergency room. They insert a breathing tube so that the patient can breathe. And now, you're the person that has to give the chest tube. That's what has to be done to save this person's life. You have all your equipment laid out, and probably there could be a lot of things going through your head. Like, if I don't do this correctly, this person can die. But is that, in that time and place, is that a helpful thought? How can you control your focus and hone in on what's going to make you perform the procedure successfully? So you lay out your equipment, and before you start your procedure, you just say the word, in this instance, smooth. So say the word smooth to yourself. That word has a calming effect. Take a deep breath, and now you focus on slow, controlled performance of that thoracotomy or chest tube. So the idea is to find these short phrases or words that kind of encompass all these other things that are going to help you be successful. And they're trigger words for a cascade of positive thoughts and positive steps that are going to help you gain a sense of control and focus over the situation versus succumbing to that heightened emotional arousal and noise. So these are just kind of like a checklist or some steps that some emergency medical providers use. Now, there may be situations in sport where things are happening really fast where you can't deliberately go through these steps, but you can use these principles and apply them in a way that makes some sense for your environment, especially like in between plays, or like if you're an offensive player when the defense is on the field. All right, you can visualize and give yourself trigger words for what you're going to do when the offense goes back in the field, things like that. Now we're going to kind of move over to the world of aviation, because I think that the aviation world's done a great job, especially at an organizational level, about how to perform under stress and mitigate the potential for human error. So we know in the aviation world, the cost of human error can be catastrophic, right? Plane crashes don't happen often, but when they do, they don't usually end well, and typically everybody in the plane dies when a plane crashes. But what aviation, I think, has done a really good job of is fostering a culture of accountability and growth versus an accountability of growth versus blame. So instead of trying to find a singular cause of error, blaming one person, the aviation world has recognized that aviation is a complex system. And even if there's a point in which one person maybe makes a mistake that leads to catastrophic harm, that person is not totally culpable, because that person's a part of a larger system. So aviation recognizes complex system versus this reductionist model where it's like, oh, well, there was a broken part of the plane, that broken part failed. An example of this is the Space Shuttle Challenger. They've attributed that failure, where all the crew members died, to, I think, like something was wrong with one of the O-rings. But it's not just about the broken O-ring. It's what are all the different things that led up to that moment in which the O-ring can fail on both like a human level, an organization level, a technological level. It's always easy to blame one person or one thing, but it's the mark of a bad system when one person's mistake can lead to catastrophic harm. There needs to be some redundancy. There needs to be some checks and balances. And another example from aviation, this is a positive one. When I was in the military, in the Air Force, before we would do a parachute jump, we started with they're called riggers. So the riggers were the people who would rig the parachutes or pack the parachutes. They would do their own safety check on the parachute before the jumpers received the parachute. Then prior to the jump, there would be a safety brief in which each of the individual jumpers would take his or her own parachute, go through a checklist where they inspect the various parts of the parachute, look for deviations from that checklists, and either address those deviations or get a new parachute. So that was kind of the second safety check. And then right before the jump, the jumper would don the parachute. And then from there, a jump master would do their own safety check where they would basically look for the same things one more time. So basically, before any jump, that parachute had been inspected 3 times by 3 different people. So you're not relying on one person to be perfect, because people aren't perfect. There needs to be redundancy. There needs to be checks and balances. And if you take a system approach to things, you're more likely to look at things holistically, where the whole isn't just the sum of the parts, versus this kind of reductionist model where it's like, oh, we're just going to blame the one person, or we're going to blame the one thing. I mean, even in the case of we can look at, like a doctor who gives the wrong medication. Like, why aren't there redundancies, checks and balances that would prevent, because everybody makes a mistake. There need to be systems that account for human error and those mistakes. So if you're interested in kind of the systems types thinking, I recommend the book Black Box Thinking. It talks about how, some of the changes the aviation world has made over the last couple of decades to reduce errors to the point that, like, plane crashes are exceptionally rare right now. And you think about maybe not so much now during COVID, but like at the peak of air travel. I mean, how many flights are up in the air each day? And you consider like how few accidents there are, even relative to auto accidents. It's pretty remarkable. Another really good resource for this type of systems thinking and the idea of accountability and growth versus blame is Sidney Decker. We did a podcast with him. If you just look up Resilient Performance Podcast, Sidney Decker, he talks about some of this stuff, and he also has some great books and resources on the subject. So next thing that the aviation world does really well is they actually have checklists and procedures that kind of address some of these worst case scenarios. So Craig Weller, another person I think I recommend if you want to get into kind of this like systems types thinking. He wrote a book called Building the Elite, which is about how to prepare for actually military special operations pipelines. He has a section on kind of psychological skills, psychological training in it. So I'm taking this quote from that chapter. And he says he was actually a member of naval special warfare. He wasn't in the aviation community per se, but I think that this quote here kind of is synergistic with a lot of things that the aviation world is preaching. He says, if your mental forecasting edits out the most unsettling of the possible scenarios, you'll create vulnerabilities in your ability to respond if and when those things happen. Remember the concept of requisite variety. If you have fewer responses than possible challenges, you'll be constrained and breakable. So this is actually, he's making a case here for negative visualization. What are you going to do if a bad thing happens? Now that might seem at odds with what I just talked about in some of Dr. Laurie's research. I think they are compatible, not dichotomous. The difference is right before you're about to do something, that's not the time to ruminate over all the bad things that can happen. But when you're not in that acutely stressful phase, when you're not having to execute that task under emotional and physical duress, think about, all right, what would you do if I was in a bad situation? Visualize, how would I handle, a potentially unforeseen problem? And then from there, you can kind of develop standard operating procedures, courses of action, checklists, and then you can rehearse and work through some of those contingencies under controlled conditions, i.e. in training, that when you encounter it in the real world, you're not trying to be creative under stress. So the idea is bad things can happen, unforeseen things can happen. We want to think through some of those scenarios when we're not actually having to execute, because we're much more likely to be creative and generate good solutions when we're not under that kind of emotional and psychological duress. We can test those things in a controlled environment, again, when we're not going to be hijacked by emotion and anxiety, and then just tinker, trial and error, see what works. And now you've created procedures for a variety of scenarios so that when that bad thing happens, when it is consequential, when you are in a real mission or when you are actually flying, you've already created that procedure and you don't need to be creative under stress. So that's the whole idea behind checklists. And I think that that's one thing the aviation world does really well. That's what I think Craig Weller is getting at here. So the idea is, again, going back to that theme of not dissociating, you want to know fear. You want to confront fear, confront reality. There's just a time and a place to do it. But to be delusional and think, well, nothing bad is ever going to happen, just like with anything else, you could be overly optimistic. If you're never pessimistic and you don't think about bad things that can happen, it's very unlikely that when that bad thing happens, you're going to creatively generate an effective solution when your life is at stake. So I think that hopefully I explained that well enough where you can see that, the things that the aviation world preaches in terms of some of the negative visualization is not at odds with, what we're hearing about in emergency medicine, where we're having more of like an optimistic approach and visualizing success. I think that we need both. It's just a matter of when we apply those different types of thinking. So what does the aviation world do really well? They have checklists, they have emergency procedures, they have courses of action. And again, they develop these things when they're not under stress. They think through some of the worst case scenarios in a controlled environment when emotional arousal and anxiety is lower, so that they're more likely to generate creative and effective solutions. But people, like Dr. Morgan said, don't get more creative under stress, they get stupider. So there's a time and a place to develop those things. But at least if you develop it when you're under less duress, now when you are under duress, as long as you can identify what the problem is, the procedure is already there. You don't have to recall it because you can refer to the checklist. And that's exactly what they do in aviation. Anytime there's an emergency landing, someone's reading from the emergency landing checklist. You're not reinventing a life and death procedure on the fly. This has happened to me. I had a moment in my military career where I was on a training jump and my main parachute deployed, but there was a malfunction where the canopy was not controllable. And long story short, if I did not cut away my main parachute, I probably would have landed on the highway, which wouldn't have been good. We had practiced and recited the emergency procedures for that scenario so many times that I was able to recall it very easily, cut away my main parachute, go to my secondary parachute, and then land like nothing happened. But had we not thought through that worst case scenario and had a checklist for an emergency procedure for that type of malfunction, that wouldn't have been the time when I had an uncontrollable canopy over my head to think, well, what do I do now? How do I make the situation better? Under stress, you want to, as much as possible, eliminate the need for creativity and information recall and just make it a totally automatic response, because your forebrain is hijacked. No matter how much neuropeptide Y you're creating, your forebrain's working against you in some of those acutely stressful situations. And in an emergency situation, and this is the beauty of checklists, a checklist can't foresee every possible scenario, but checklists can have procedures for particular patterns or sort of chunks of problems, clusters of problems. A speedy and good solution under stress is better than a slow and perfect solution under stress. And a slow and perfect solution requires creativity. And when it's life and death, time can be a constraint that can prevent that creative thinking. So slow and good is kind of the essence of what checklists and emergency procedures are all about. Or sorry, fast and good, not slow and good. Fast and good, that's kind of the essence of what a checklist or an emergency procedure is all about. So checklists minimize degrees of freedom. In other words, they eliminate choice. When this bad thing happens, you do this. You've identified the problem. You don't need to think through 10 different contingencies. Again, to the extent possible. Checklists are protective against anxiety and complacency, regardless of experience or competence. So, and that's a good thing, right? Because no matter how good people are, they make mistakes. Another example of this is anytime you go in a plane, you can't hear it because the cockpit is locked, and this isn't on the intercom, but no matter how many sorties a pilot has flown, a pilot can have thousands of sorties. They still, before they take off, from the runway, they read through their takeoff procedures. They don't solely rely on their experience, because takeoff and landing are like typically the most dangerous aspects of flight. So they want to make sure that an error is not made. They don't rely on someone's memory, even if someone's taken off and landed the plane thousands of times. They read through that checklist. You're seeing it now in surgery too. Something as obvious as, do I do surgery on the right leg or the left leg? There's been instances in surgery where people have operated on the wrong leg because that's like kind of like a mindless thing. What leg do I do the procedure on versus thinking about, okay, like what procedure am I doing? What pieces of anatomy do I have to move out of the way? Well, it's almost like the which leg to do it on is inconsequential because it's so not intellectually stimulating, but it's also really important because if you do surgery on the wrong leg, you didn't fix the problem and now you created a new problem. So even surgery now, they use checklists. It can be a surgeon that's done that same procedure, again, hundreds, thousands of times, but there's going to be someone who has control over that surgery, who's kind of like the conductor of the orchestra, and is going to say, okay, is the tourniquet on the right leg? Yes, no, before we cut into things. So again, it's not to patronize people. humans make mistakes, and to the extent that we can eliminate human error by simple things like checklists and minimize choice when we don't have to, we're going to be better off. So checklists also control focus and attention, because once you've identified a problem and you know which procedure to choose from, now you can focus on the checklist, which is the procedure that's going to help you to get out of that bad situation. Checklists also confirm a sense of agency, and they decrease dissociation, because you know that, okay, you can have trust, you can have faith in that checklist because you know that you've tested it under, less stressful conditions, and it sort of proved the test of time in some of your training scenarios, and you've already vetted that procedure, so it gives you a sense of control versus having to, again, create a new solution on the fly. Also, reviewing checklists and emergency procedures serve as mental rehearsals. So this is something that we did before every parachute jump, every scuba dive, any kind of even tactical scenario. We would rehearse our emergency procedures before the mission or the training event. So at least, we're getting that mental rep. It's kind of like being in that fMRI machine. We're not actually executing the task, but we're visualizing, what does it feel like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? And if you do that, you're actually getting a mental rehearsal, which is not going to be as good as actually getting the physical rep, but it's better than not doing anything. And the last thing that checklists do is they reduce the need for memory, because again, like parts of your brain associated with memory, they don't do better when you've got stress hormones surging through your body. And if you think about in medicine, I mean, the biggest emergency is cardiac arrest. When someone's not breathing, when their heart's not beating, that's when you see, CPRs and defibrillators. And even the American Heart Association, the governing body of what the cardiac life support protocols, like they dictate those protocols. They've said, if you're running a code, which means basically supervising somebody in a cardiac arrest scenario, they give you these little cheat sheets, these pocket guides, and they encourage one person, somebody who's not actually performing any of the procedures, to read through the checklist verbatim so that steps aren't missed, somebody doesn't give the wrong drug dosage. So if we're saying that even in the greatest possible emergency, we encourage people to not rely on memory, because you can look things up on your phone in 5 seconds, but even if you have that cheat sheet, that piece of paper checklist in your hand, why would you rely on memory when you don't have to? Because all that can happen is it's all downside, no upside. You're more likely to forget something. And when someone's heart isn't beating, if you miss one step, that could be the difference between survival or death. So to the extent possible, we want to eliminate the need for memory, and that's what checklists do. And that's also why, if you look at any kind of like training and education, I mean, the idea that our tests should be kind of memory centric is just, in my opinion, very antiquated, because we have checklists, we can look things up, we have the technology where memory isn't as important. And most things that we are really important, we've physically done enough that we actually remember them without having to make a conscious effort to recall them. But even the doctors, nurses who have gone through cardiac arrest protocols, again, hundreds of times, they still refer to that checklist, because why take the chance that you might forget something? You have a bad day, you miss a step, and now something that could have been preventable and successful had a catastrophic outcome, because frankly, people are just oftentimes too prideful. They want to make things hard when they don't have to be. So that's a little bit about, I think what sport can learn from the world of aviation in terms of emotional regulation, emotional control, psychological preparation. I want to get a little bit into some insightful things I've heard from sport coaches. I'll start with Steve Magnus again, track coach for University of Houston. I remember him saying at a seminar, it's not the thought, it's the emotion that we attach to it. So these thoughts, these emotions, or these thoughts really, they're not good or bad. It's how do we respond to that thought? And that's where the whole emotional regulation side of things comes in, because again, once you're outside that homeostatic range of emotion, you're more likely to have your decision-making hijacked. Fatigue is a form of stress. Steve talks about how fatigue biases us towards impulsive, short-term decisions. because fatigue is induced by, in this case, a track athlete, the physical stress of running the race and the psychological stress of competing and wanting to do a good job. Now, attaching the right or the wrong emotion to a thought does require awareness, just like going back to the aviation world. You have to identify the problem so that you can pick the right emergency procedure or the right checklist. You need to be self-aware and identify which emotions are helpful and which emotions are harmful from a performance standpoint. And so one of the things that Steve talks about that he does with his athletes is he has them watch bad performances to learn to regulate their emotional response. It's the same thing that in the military special operations courses, the instructors do with candidates. They want you to learn how to deal with failure. It's, failure is inevitable. And I think that in a lot of situations where people have performance anxiety, it's the fear of failure. And if you can get people comfortable with failure, they'll realize, oh, like I've run a bad race before, or I've failed to execute something very well in a training scenario before. And like, unlike the military, sometimes, like if you run a bad race, you're going to get to live to run again. So that's the beauty of sport, is like, you can make a mistake and learn from it. But you have to have the right level of optimism to treat failures as opportunity for growth and not hide from them. Like, don't say, oh, well, in this case, I ran a bad race, I'm just going to pretend that it never happened. Steve deliberately talks about how he has people watch these bad performances to see if they can recreate that emotional response so they can better identify it the next time and see if they can have a more constructive way of dealing with that performance anxiety. Another thing that he talks about, and this is very similar to what Dr. Laurie talked about with emergency medicine, is like, how do we manipulate time, space, and tactics? So to manipulate time, he talks about how he has days where the athletes aren't allowed to wear a watch. So basically, it's introducing some uncertainty or some ambiguity into the training, because even a track meet, like, yeah, okay, I've got to run this distance, and typically this time will make me competitive. But there's even uncertainties in track. And if you never introduce uncertainty into your training, you're not likely to respond well to uncertainty when it matters much more in competition. So like anything else that can be taken too far, you don't want all of your training to have like zero structure where you don't wear a watch. But there should be days where you make people uncomfortable and you deviate from the structure of a typical practice. So things like no watch days, doing intervals in lane 6, a follow the leader, or what Steve calls a natural fartlek, where it's just kind of like you've got a group running, and instead of the first, the typical fartlek where the last person runs to the front of the line, like pretty much anybody can surge to the front. And so it just creates that element of unpredictability, which, that's the nature of a race. So instead of like all the time doing a traditional fartlek where who's going to surge and who's going to stay back, you're kind of simulating racing by introducing that element of chaos and unpredictability into the training. You can manipulate group dynamics. You can, have unknown surges where like each runner in the group gets one at an unknown time, doing, workouts where you go one rep at a time without knowing the entire workout. So, typically you'll get to a practice and it's like, okay, we're going to do 5 800s at this pace. Well, maybe, in this scenario, you don't know what the entire workout is. So you did an 800. You don't know if you're running another 800 next, a 400, a mile, or what pace. So just getting people uncomfortable with unpredictability. Even things like delegating decision-making to the athlete, because there are going to be times in a track meet where, the athlete can't rely on the coach. So even something as simple as like, okay, saying, I want you to run, X number of meters in this practice at this particular pace, you decide how you want to do it. So, you give them the total tempo volume, and then you delegate how that's broken up to the athlete. So, teaching the athlete how to be autonomous, independent, and to make some decisions under time constraints, unpredictability. Again, it's not to say that like coaches don't ever need to script the practice, because I think that there's a place for that structure too, especially when you're trying to develop a particular thing. It always comes down to what's your intent. But if you're trying to, create adaptable athletes who can respond well to uncertainty, if your practices are always certain and very scripted, then you can't expect them to rise to that challenge in a meet. And that's, similar to what the the military does. So now I'm going to get into some insight from the special operations community. As I talked about, like, I think that the sporting world often takes the wrong things from the military. It's not about abstract qualities allegedly developed during grueling workouts. I think it's more about taking a systems approach to performance. At the tactical level, and this goes back to some of the things that Steve talks about, how do you introduce unpredictability and chaos, albeit in a controlled and systematic way so that you can actually track progress and you're not just haphazardly throwing these chaotic challenges at people. But some things that you do in the military in a training scenario to develop this adaptability is you alter deadlines in the midst of mission planning. So you might say, okay, you have 24 hours during a multi-day exercise to plan this mission. So now the commander is under the impression that he or she has a full day to plan that mission. And then 8 hours later, you say, you know what? The deadline changed. You actually have 12 hours. So it's been 8 hours, you have 4 more hours. So just teaching commanders how to plan and think on their feet, because you don't always have the time that you think you're going to have. So again, manipulating time, deliberately providing misleading intelligence prior to an exercise. That's communication and information are always, and that's, I rarely say always, but are almost always somewhat misleading in military operations. So you're never going to have perfect intelligence, but sometimes in training, deliberately giving the wrong information. So now when people are executing in the mission, you can see how they actually adapt. Again, you wouldn't want to do every training mission like that, because now people come to the conclusion, well, I don't need to plan anymore because it's just going to change. You want to have kind of flexible structure. You need to have structure and mission planning templates. So you have some kind of a framework from which to operate, but you also need those frameworks to be adaptable. So in training, deliberately providing misleading information prior to an exercise is a way to develop that ability to think on one's feet. Randomly introducing casualties into scenarios, anointing new leaders. So, some like one commander might think that they're in charge during the course of an exercise, and then midway through, the second or third in command has to do it. So no one ever gets comfortable. There's a saying that you're always, you could be one bullet away from being the team leader if you're in a small team. So the people who are one bullet away need to practice being the leader, because the reality is that the leadership can change in a dynamic and complex mission set, whether there's a casualty or not. Because sometimes you have to split the team up to do follow-on missions, or if the objective changes. So anointing new leaders and not just having the same people constantly in a leadership role is very helpful. It also helps the leaders to be followers sometimes too, to see things from a different perspective. And one more thing at the tactical level, dropping the team off at the wrong location. So if you think you're at point A and you get dropped off at point B, and you're taking the heading that you thought you were going to use from point A, only to realize that you're actually in the wrong place and you've gone even further in the wrong direction. It's like, well, what do you do now? Do you try to make up that time and execute your original mission? Do you scrap the mission? These are all things that are realities of combat that need to be rehearsed, because again, no one's going to get more creative and more adept under stress. You have to practice these things. And then at the strategic level, it's basically, you've got tactical, strategic. Strategic is a little bit more macro, tactical is a little bit more micro, but you want to integrate organizational and team dynamics a little bit more at the strategic level. And that would include things like, this is like a cultural ethos of the special operations community. Accountability to one's teammates is a big thing. So after any real world mission or any training scenario, you're tired, you're dirty, you want to take care of all of your personal gear, but you never take care of your personal gear, or you never tend to your own needs until all the team gear is taken care of. Because even if you're being relieved by another team or another crew, you want to make sure that all the team gear is operable before that next team gets on shift. So it's the same thing with, like, you look at a firehouse, right? Before those firefighters get off shift and they tend to their own needs and take a shower and relax for the day, they're going to make sure that all that team gear is ready for the next crew, because the next crew is going to have to do a follow-on mission. So that's a big thing, and it's something that I think is preached a lot in sports, but when push comes to shove, people seldom actually adhere to it. So accountability to one's teammates is huge. planning for a variety of contingencies. That's something I think the sporting world could do a little bit better. So we talked about courses of action, emergency procedures. Craig Weller talking about knowing fear and negative visualizations. There's a lot of scenarios in sport where I think because coaches, understandably, like they want to be clever and they want their thinking to be the reason why a team succeeded or failed during a game. A lot of the scenarios that are maybe are presumably unforeseeable during a game are foreseeable, and if they were thought through in a more controlled environment like practice, now when you're in that difficult situation in the game, you could say, okay, well, we've already discussed what we're going to do in this type of situation, or for this particular you could call it even like pattern recognition. For this particular pattern of scenarios, this is what we're going to do. Not to say that like coaches, you can always prepare for every scenario, but trying to just be like win by being clever all the time, that can backfire because human error under stress is a real thing. And if you can rely on creating procedures and systems when you're not as stressed, not as emotionally aroused, now you can apply those emergency procedures, those courses of action, as long as you can identify the problem during a game. Another thing, and again, this is something a lot of people talk about but don't actually do, is systematic training progressions and adherence to standards. So like there are certain skills in special operations community of the military where like you're not going to step B until you complete step A. You're not going to step C until you complete step B, and you have to demonstrate proficiency before you move on to the next thing. And there's always a temptation to kind of change standards, lower standards, but those standards a lot of times are what allow people to have trust in each other. And as soon as you violate those standards, now people lose trust in their organization and their teammates. So you've got to be systematic about your training. And if you believe those standards matter, you have to adhere to them and not make exceptions if you think they're really important. We already talked about emphasis on procedure. And this is one too that kind of is counterintuitive and from the special operations community and the military. Leaders need to be hands-off sometimes. So if you look at the movies of you'll see these generals that are like charging to the front of the line and like inspiring the troops. But the reality is that a team leader, someone who's responsible for the tactical execution of a mission, and a strategic leader like a general are two different things. So the strategic leader is the conductor of the orchestra. Once that conductor starts playing an instrument, they lose sight of the symphony and the bigger picture, and they can't hear how all those sounds come together. So as soon as you get you start getting your hands dirty, you become myopic. And that's similar to what I talked about with the cardiac arrest scenario. Like if the person that's manning that defibrillator, or the person that's doing the IV, or the person that's inserting the breathing tube, if they're also in charge of making sure, in charge of reading that checklist and making sure that everyone else is doing their jobs, like once they have a very hands-on type job to do, they become myopic, and it's much harder to listen to that orchestra playing. So, tactical and strategic leaders in the military typically shouldn't be the ones doing the shooting, because they need to see everything that's going on and have what's called situational awareness, or big picture awareness of what's going on. So as counterintuitive as it can be, trying to always be the hands-on person as a leader can actually make people worse leaders. And the last thing is embracing diversity of thought. An example of this from special operations community is just the way that they debrief missions. So after any kind of training mission or real world mission, the team sits around the room and the team leader will kind of summarize, what went on, what they think were the key points of success or failure. But then from that point on, you go around the room and anybody, regardless of rank or position, can suggest something that they think would ensure success or better execution on the next mission or scenario. So, it takes a certain amount of humility to have that, because again, a lot of people preach humility, but they're also not willing to, accept, like if you're a coach, not willing to accept ideas from athletes. And sometimes, even the last player on the bench might have an idea that could provide some strategic insight for the next game. So like anything else, it has to be done within reason. If you have a team of 100 people, maybe you don't have 100 people go around the room, but diversity of thought's really important to minimize complacency. So I feel like any organization should have some kind of a system in place to ensure that multiple voices are heard and that anybody in the organization has a voice and can audit performance. So covered a lot of things here, and I know at times it seems like some of these things might not be that connected to sport or related to psychological preparation or mental toughness. It can be difficult to kind of separate physical execution from psychological preparation from emotion, because the reality is, we put these things into buckets. It makes things easier to compartmentalize, easier to learn. But the whole thing here is like in sports or in the military or in aviation, emergency medicine, people are trying to execute skills in a complex environment with unpredictability, time constraints, lack of information, and psychological preparation is one component of that, but it's often difficult to separate the psychological component from everything else, because ultimately it is kind of all one thing. Not to get too philosophical there, but I would say if you remember anything from this presentation in closing, I just want to play this clip from the movie Man on Fire, because it's not about trying to be the toughest, mentally toughest, the most conditioned, unless that physical conditioning is what matters to your sport. It's really what it comes down to is, are you prepared or not? And I think if we always go back to that question is this thing that I'm doing helping to ensure preparation? Keep doing it. If it seems overly tangential, it probably is. So we'll close with Denzel here.
I've got crazy.
No such thing as tough. There's trained and there's untrained. Now, which are you?
Train.
Trained. Okay, let's go again.
There's no such thing as tough. There's trained or untrained. So since if you're working with athletes, military, medical providers, aviation, just try to be the best trained organization you can. And if you're the best trained, the psychological component will take care of itself, and you won't have to worry about being tough for its own sake. Here are some of the references. And thank you for your attention, and look forward to continuing this conversation and hopefully gaining some insight from what it is that you're all doing.